We're continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. Last time in Chapter 2, we quoted Lacan as saying that part of the goal of therapy is to get at that speech which is to be reconquered in the unconscious, since it's that part of the subject separated from his or her history. In this chapter, Resistance and the Defenses, Lacan is careful to say that the role of the analyst ought not be tyrannical here. It's irresponsible and unethical to impose an interpretation onto the patient's case. Psychoanalysis is, as we have said, an experience of the particular and involves the patient's self-discovery. Self-discovery can't be imposed on someone. Interestingly, Lacan opens the session in this chapter, Chapter 3, with some cautious remarks toward two of his students who in seminar presentations have alleged Freud was authoritarian in his approach. Lacan calls that reproach of theirs paradoxical, since he says, if anything constitutes the originality of the analytic treatment, it is rather to have perceived at the beginning, right from the start, the problematical relation of the subjects to themselves. The real find, the discovery, is to have conjoined this relation with the meaning of symptoms. Freud respected a patient's self-interpretation, however driven by ego integrity that self-interpretation might have been. But recognizing that this self-interpretation was what brought the patient to treatment in the first place, what is partially responsible for the symptom, he knew he needed to be delicate about how he approached this kind of self-interpretation. So far from being an authoritarian, he was every bit the libertarian in how he cared for patients. So Lacan wants to argue. Lacan stresses on page 29 that psychoanalysis is a technique which respects the person. It would be crude and paradoxical, Lacan says, to place in the foreground the idea that analytical technique has as its aim to break down the subject's resistance. For a therapist to try to break down a patient's resistance is just to pit one ego up against another. This just leads to a transfer of feelings, since he says on page 30, as soon as you put two subjects together, feelings are always reciprocated. And just as importantly, to challenge a patient's self-interpretation on the grounds that it constitutes a resistance is to misunderstand what resistance even is in the therapeutic setting. On page 34, Lacan quotes Freud's definition from the interpretation of dreams. Quote, whatever interrupts the progress of analytic work is a resistance. Oh, actually, sorry, that's on page 33. He quotes Freud. Again, the quote is, whatever interrupts the progress of analytic work is a resistance. And then he says on page 34, what is at issue is the continuation of the treatment of the work. Lacan believes we can take our cue from Freud here in what to do when the treatment meets an impasse. Time and again, in Freud's treatment, when problems arose in getting the patient to overcome a pathology, Freud trusted sufficiently in the subject's center of gravity, in this present synthesis of the past which we call history. Sorry, I actually skipped a line. Let me go back and say that again. Lacan believes we can take our cue from Freud in what to do when the treatment meets an impasse. Time and again in Freud's treatment, when problems arose in getting the patient to overcome a pathology, he says on page 36, Freud trusted sufficiently in the subject's implicit structuration. That is to say, he trusted implicitly, Freud did, in the patient's self-understanding, the subject's center of gravity in the present synthesis of the past which we call history. Lacan says it is in that we trust when it's a matter of keeping the work going. This is what is presupposed by analysis from its beginnings, Lacan says on page 36. So you have to trust the patient, Lacan is saying. Even if the analyst sees the initial self-interpretation as symptomatic of the patient's problems, he or she does not intervene with his or her own interpretation. that would wreck the whole thing, not only pitting the analyst ego up against the patient's, but implicitly saying to the patient, what you say has no importance. Or as Lacan puts it on page 37, your discourse has no importance. So we see the analyst does not try to impose an interpretation onto the patients. Then how does one come to undergo change and receive alleviation from suffering in analysis? Hopefully this will be a question we can address with some sort of answer as we continue our study. Thank you for listening.